Okay, so now it's time to start taking this transmission apart. Now as you can see, it is red. That is because I'm converting it to the 5-speed with live PTO. So this is the replacement transmission. And I just throw out a couple other notes on this transmission before I get into it. Bought it used, so I don't really know the condition of it. I know a little bit from kind of exploring a little bit, but for the most part I don't know much about it. I do have the shifter. It's actually off right now. That's little guy that should be right there. It does go through all the gears. There is a little rust on some of the gears, but I'm going to fix that. And the input shaft, pretty wore out. So that should be a bearing somewhere, either a tapered bearing or a needle bearing, but that'll be fixed. Like I said, here's the shifter. Here's the shifter. I've already got it off, sandblasted and painted. When you take these off, you're going to take this nut, and there'll be a washer, and then there's a spring that goes down in here, about that long. And you have a Woodruff key. This is actually the first thing you're going to take apart to get the transmission apart, is taking that shifter off. Not too much back here. This is my new drive that has to be adapted in one way or another to the rear end for the selective speed conversion. I do have a good clutch pedal. And I know it's asked a lot. People want to know what kind of tractor they have. On the side of the transmission, just behind your starter, it'll say right here your model number and then a serial number. Now on the selective speed, I can't read any of this. This is off a diesel, this transmission, and the diesels always wanted to corrode real bad, I guess, from people filling the batteries up, so they're a little harder to read. But this is a 961-D. So this transmission's out of a 961 model tractor that was a diesel, and since there's nothing out here, it was actually a tricycle tractor with the dual front wheels really close. If there was a 5, it'd be a wide front. If it was a 1 out here, it'd be the single front. And the serial number on this one, I can't really make out. There is a 4, a 6, and a 7 there, but these other numbers I can't make out. Okay, so that's about all there is to really say about this transmission. It's a 5-speed with a live PTO out of a 961, which is a row crop. It's going back in a row crop. So let's get it tore apart. So like I said, your first step is going to be removing your shifter, which the guy that shipped me this transmission, he already took it off, but he included all the parts. There is just a plain Jane nut here. This is actually supposed to be an acorn nut, so I'm going to have to get one of those. Like I said, the Woodruff key, and then your spring, all that's here. Take all this off, and I'm going to go ahead and break the fill plug loose. That way I'm not trying to hold this plate and do it. And then these perimeter bolts, which as you can see, mine's already up because like I say, I already opened it up and inspected this tranny to make sure everything's okay and usable. And I got these sitting here. These are off the clutch pedal. I'll explain those later. So let me get this guy off. We'll go ahead and remove all these bolts here. And then lift up on our top plate. And if you need to change your starter button, You have to knock these tabs off this nut and take this nut loose, and then your starter button will come out. I am going to put a new one on it. And here's a look down into the transmission. It's not a whole lot to see just yet because it's kind of dark, but I'll explain stuff as it comes out. Okay, the next part we're going to take off is our reverse idler housing and gear, which is right here. As you see, these are all studs, but only one of the studs stayed in the case. The rest came out with the nuts. Okay, and I just took a pry bar, stuck it in here on this edge, and basically pried it against the gear in here to rock this off. And there is an O-ring seal here. This O-ring is available from New Holland, so you don't have to worry about that. You can see a little bit of the rust here on the gears, which is probably normal for any tractor that has set. You'll probably get some condensation in here and get some rust. The next thing we're going to take off is going to be basically our throwout bearing assembly, or clutch release bearing if you want to call it that. But the first thing we got to do is release this spring right here. Now, as you can see, it's got a tang right here in the case, right there, where the spring hits it, and then it hits up here on our fork. So what we want to do is we're going to move this over here to release this spring. See, now our throwout bearing can easily move since we're not under spring pressure no more. So we're going to take and slide our throwout bearing. So hang on, I got to take the clutch pedal off. That's something I should have mentioned. You're going to have to take your clutch linkage off, so that way the pedal will rotate further. And you're just going to pull your bearing forward until the hub pops off. And as you see, it says top right there. So when we put it back, we'll have to make sure that that's facing up. Now the bearing itself will actually pop off of this hub, and we replace literally just the bearing. Which, that one sounds real good. Not. Okay, there's a bolt and a nut right there that actually hold our shift fork to this shaft. So now I need to take this nut and bolt out, and then we'll be able to pull the shaft out of the side of the transmission, which will release our spring and our fork, and then that'll allow us in here at our clutch shaft bushings. Okay, so there's that bolt out. This is a type of lock nut on here. However, that one did not really lock, so I'll either replace that with like a nylock or put some Loctite on this. So now this shaft will slide out to the left-hand side of the transmission. So there's our spring. Our clutch fork, and the shaft. This shaft has some pretty good wear on it, but it should be usable. The next part we're wanting to take out is going to be our input shaft seal retainer, throwout bearing retainer. I've heard this called different names, but basically we're going to take this plate off. There'll be a seal in here and a gasket. Okay, so once you got the 6 nuts and lock washers off, that retainer should slide off. Probably gonna have to wiggle it to get it to break free. Okay. So there's our retainer. Then we have 2 thrust washers here. One steel and one that looks kind of coppery. And I can probably now go ahead and get the shafts out. Now on mine being a live PTO, this big shaft here is the PTO. This is the transmission input shaft. So they're going to come out together. However, they are separate and do come apart. So be careful when you take them out. So now that we have our throwout bearing retainer off and both input shafts out, the next piece to come off is this bearing retainer right here. However, this one will not just slide right out, because if you look down in here towards your bottom, you will see your PTO gear. So to get this gear or this retainer out, slide it forward, reach back into the rear of the transmission where the main gears are, and lift up on the main shaft, and then pull the retainer. And there's a gasket right here. Okay, so now that we have our front bearing support removed, we're going to move to the rear of the transmission now, and we're going to remove this bearing support. I'm going to go ahead and remove my output shaft and drive shaft. And now we're going to remove these 6 bolts. And something I've noticed I'm not sure if this is correct or not, but I have two different length bolts here. These two middle ones are shorter and don't have lock washers, which I got a bolt down here that's different from everything else, so somebody's probably been in here before. So I'm going to have to research and figure out if those are supposed to be like that or supposed to be the same as the other guys. And when you take this cover off, there's these metal shims right here. Do not lose these. These are to set the preload on these bearings. Okay, so now we're ready to pull out our top main gear of the transmission. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab it, lift it up, slide it forward, and then come out rear side first. This large gear that stays back here in the rear is going to stay there for a little bit because it will not clear our main gear on the bottom. And now our next step is going to be removing this Pto support. And there's that different bolt that I was talking about just a minute ago. It's actually got one over here that looks similar. And that right there is what's actually engaging our Pto shaft. So when this is back, see how this will spin? This is when your Pto is disengaged. Whenever you slide your lever on the side of the transmission, or your side of your rear housing of your tractor, this will slide forward and engage your Pto. So there is a detent here, it looks like. So make sure this thing wants to lock in really well if yours is not. Or if your Pto wants to, pop out of gear or something, just make sure that detent's working properly. And just slide the Pto shifter off. A couple of things I think I neglected to mention. There is a seal that rides right here that will separate your hydraulics from your transmission. There's also a seal up here on this output that also separates the hydraulics from the transmission. Because back in the day, they wanted gear oil in the transmission and hydraulic oil in hydraulics. Nowadays you can do that, or you can choose to run a hydraulic oil into everything. It's kind of up to you. The next thing we want to take out are 3 detent plugs, springs, and plungers. If your transmission is jumping out of gear, these are what you're going to want to inspect. Plungers could be wore, spring could be broke, or weak. Just have to pull these out and inspect them. So there's a plug. Our spring, and the detent's still in there. Probably have to grab a magnet to get that. Okay. There's a little detent. I was able just to pull it out with a pick. So this one here looks pretty good. You basically just want to see how wore out that little ball tip is. And there's also a gasket here, which I don't think you can see it in the video because my hand's probably in the way. Whenever you start to take them off, you'll see like the gasket kind of just fall apart. I believe you can get these detents from New Holland if you need them. Mine look all okay so far. Yeah, mine all look good, so I'm not going to have to worry with them. Okay, so our next step is going to be removing this top expansion plug. We're just going to take a punch and a hammer, go in from the inside, and knock it out. Should come out fairly easily. These plugs, you may be able to reuse them, you may not. It just depends on how snug they fit back into here. And I would recommend, if you plan on reusing them, go ahead and put numbers on them so you get them right or back in the same holes. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is loosen these two bolts. And this is going to remove our third and reverse shift forks and our gate. You want these bolts loose enough to where this shift rail will slide, because we're now going to slide this shift rail all the way out the rear of the transmission where we just took that expansion plug out. I'm going to go ahead and pull my bolts all the way out because they seem to be still holding me up here. Either that or my shift forks or shift rails rusted, which is a good possibility. As you see, I'm wiggling it and it's slowly starting to come out of the fork. It's locked up on something here. It might be locked on my gate because my fork is moving pretty easily. So let me see if I can wiggle that gate some. Okay, so there's the gate loose. These things can be a little stubborn, but just keep working it and it'll come off. The problem I'm having right this minute is this fork is not wanting to slide on this rail, I'm guessing due to some rust. So I'm having to just kind of tap it back and forth until it'll clear everything, because the gate's nice and loose. It's just that fork. So as you're sliding this rail out, your shift gate's going to come loose. And this is the third and reverse shift gate. Each one of these gates are unique, but just remember which ones are what. Same thing goes for your shift forks. Each one's unique. Just remember which one is which. And the rail. The rails I think are also unique, but just keep in mind what's what. And inspect these detent grooves here. Now we should be able to pull this output gear out. Just like so. The next step is to do the exact same thing with your 1-2 shift rail and your 4-5 shift rail. Loosen the bolts, knock the expansion plugs out, and slide the rails backwards. There's both expansion plugs out. There's both of the 1-2 bolts out, both out of the gate and the fork. You may have to come in here and just kind of tap them to get them started to come breaking free. Be careful tapping on this stuff because it is cast iron. I think it's either cast iron or forged, but just be careful with it. Like, go slow. There's a 1-2 fork. One, two gate. And the 1-2 rail. So now we got the 4-5 fork and gate assembly. There's no separate gate here. So remove the bolt. Now this one being the fork and the gate together is a lot more difficult to remove. It's more difficult to remove because not only do you have to fight, you know, your shift fork, but you also have to fight the gate into the little interlock type plate here. So it's hard to make everything move and to get the rail to slide. Going together, it's a lot easier. Coming apart, it's a pain in the butt. So you have to kind of line up. You kind of have to line this gate up with this plate so that it'll slide. But keep in mind that center piece there is part of your vertical shift rail, so you don't want to hit it so hard you break it. So going back together, all that'll be lubricated and it'll just slide together nice and easy. Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of skip the step in the book a minute. This little interlock plate right here has a hinge pin right there. I'm going to go ahead and pull it out. You're going to slide this rod up through one of the bolt holes. It's just a long rod. See, now that gate or interlock or whatever is nice and loose in here, and hopefully that'll allow me to be able to move that shifter a little bit better and get that 4 and 5 fork to cooperate and come out. It's hard to see what I'm doing, but I'm basically taking my left hand and reaching way up here and pushing on this shift rail from behind that boss right there, while tapping this to move that fork that way. Alright. 4-5 shift rail. 4 and 5 fork. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and just lift this hinge piece out of here. Now, this piece will go one way. You notice here on this back side, this piece is bent outwards. That goes towards the outside of the case. And these middle fingers are bent. That is normal. So don't freak out if you see that. That is normal. A little hinge rod that went right through here. If you cannot get it through this hole, there is a plug, a pipe plug, just below it on the left hand side of the transmission towards the bottom. You can take that plug out and the rod will go down. So you can either pull it up or down. You have either way. Here's the plug for the hinge rod if you can't get it out the top. Our next step is going to be taking the shifter arm out, and there's another detent right here. So just like our shift rails, we have the plug and a gasket, the spring, which here's a good example. Let me show you something. This is the spring off of my shifter detent. If you look here at the bottom, see how the coil spring gets really close and is flat? But then you look up here at the top, this is actually broken. So there's a chance this transmission would probably not shift well or go into gear properly or come out because that's broken. So I'm going to have to replace this spring. Somewhere in here there should be another piece of that spring. Right there. There's the other piece of that spring. It's only missing, you know, one coil, but that can affect the spring pressure. And here's our other detent. Yeah, the detent itself does not look too bad. So now we'll come back up top And just lift our shifter straight up and out. And there's where that detent would ride. The next thing we're going to take out is this front bearing retainer on our lower shaft. It's these 4 bolts, and I believe this one has an O-ring behind it, not a gasket. Okay, and there's the front cap with the O-ring. So now that we have the front bearing retainer off on this lower shaft, we're going to pull out our PTO counter shaft. So this guy. You're going to pull it out. Next we're going to reach in here and slide our main cluster gear back as far as we can get it. And then we're going to lift it up. And we're going to come out the front end this time. You know, our counter shaft up top, we came rear first. This one we're coming front first. That one sound you heard was the bearing on the rear falling off. And then the next thing is your PTO gear at the front of the case. So now the transmission is now fully disassembled. The only other thing that we need to inspect are the hydraulic pipes. And to inspect those, you're going to do a visual inspection to check for cracks. If you don't see any, then you're going to go to like a pressure test. Which the way that I'm going to check mine is actually using a vacuum gauge. Or a vacuum hand pump if you want to call it that. I'm going to plug one end of these tubes and then pull a vacuum on it and make sure that it holds vacuum. If it does, the tube is good. If it don't, they will have to be replaced. So we'll get them checked and start getting this guy cleaned up. And then it'll be ready to be sandblasted. But that's it for getting it disassembled.